As I said, I'm going to start off a little bit about my presentation. It's called My Story, Our Story. I do want to warn people, just a little bit of a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about my career. It's actually interesting because I have presented this in a few places across Canada. My family actually hasn't heard this story, so they'll be hearing this for the first time. But there is maybe a few trigger warnings in here. There's no graphic pictures or anything like that, but want people to know that, I will talk about a couple of the calls for service that kind of affected me. Don't go into graphic detail, but if you are getting triggered with that, please reach out to us via the chat and we'll help you with resources as we go. So I said, we'll start off first with my story, our story. So this young gentleman, this skinny little runt here, started back in December 1999. Changed a little bit. This picture, as you can see on the other side, was the last few months in our vice unit, where I was able to grow a little bit of a beard and have a little bit of fun, and I'll get into a little bit of that later on. And now I'm back to, I know I probably look about 50 years older, but back to the clean-shaven, short-haired little guy that started in December 1999. I had an amazing career. I've worked in a ton of great units all over police service. As I said, you'll hear with my story, I wouldn't have changed anything. I wish there's some things that I knew back then that I know now that could help me through my journey. But as you can see, I got to work in a lot of great units with a lot of great people. On top of our regular work through the police service, I also got to spend 16 years on SWAT. I was our public and officer safety training coordinator for about 10 years at the police college, some of the greatest times of my life. A lot of my work too, luckily I got to work with our Regina Police Association board. I was president for 2 terms, been president of the SaskFed and on the Canadian Police Association board of directors for over 10 years. And in 2021, one of the most important things was I was diagnosed with PTSD. So these dates, I just want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind, 2004 to 2021. Just throughout this presentation, just keep those dates in your mind as we go forward. So where did it all start? Well, 2004 is kind of where the journey really started. We were quite a junior service back in 2004. We were hiring, if you remember, we were putting through double classes from about 2000 to 2005. I had 3 years on. In my second year, I was actually training people. That's how junior we were. And, in 2004, I actually had a partner. She had 1 year on and we were working together. And one of the calls we went to was there was a call from a young girl that called in, said she just went over to her boyfriend's house and she'd found him hanging. So me and my partner were quite close. We get there, still vividly remember we went down, it was kind of a bi-level, went down about 5 stairs and we could see this young teenage boy hanging. So you think, 3 years on, and through police college, one of the things I'll never forget that they taught us is if you think someone's deceased, you don't want to cut them down because you want to see the integrity of the knot to make sure it was a suicide, not a homicide. And so here's a 3-year member with really not knowing anything about policing. We have this young gentleman that, in my mind had passed away. When people pass away, certain things happen to them. And I thought he'd passed away. And EMS was actually pretty close behind us. They come in and kind of made the same assumption, and then they put the little monitor on his finger. And I remember the EMS supervisor saying he has a pulse. So we cut him down. We begin working on him. End up staying with the family. They transport him. And later that night, we're back at the office and, dealing with a family that, went through a traumatic incident like this. You were there for a few hours and never remember going back. And one of my buddies that was at the hospital with the young man. He said, hey, how's he doing? And he goes, well, if he would have been maybe cut down a few minutes earlier, he would have survived, but it looks like he's going to pass away. So for 17 years, I thought that, my inaction had caused the death of this young man. Going on to our next call, 2006, I was in plainclothes unit, went to the north. There was a call coming from the Northgate Mall that 2 seniors had been run over by another senior in a vehicle. We get there. Unfortunately, the one senior had passed away and the other one was trapped under the car. You get to these scenes and we've all been to them, a lot of people running around. We didn't know what to do. Fire was ways away. We were looking for jacks from vehicles. We were actually looking at, 10 people to try to lift the car off, try to help these people. at the end, both of them ended up passing away. But, at one point I was down with the one person and talking to him, knowing that they weren't going to live through it, but trying to, reaffirm that they were going to be okay. If you remember back in 2006, cell phones were pretty new. And I remember this young kid was trying to take pictures of this gentleman. At one point, I think it was a foot away from him, taking a picture of him as he was passing away. And I was walking away as other members showed up. This guy tried to take a picture again. And I remember grabbing him and throwing up against a vehicle and just absolutely losing it on him. And then realizing, I got to be careful here. You lose my job, but I couldn't believe someone would want to take pictures of someone that was passing away. And it's funny though, because he walked away and he's going to complain and get my job. And I had about 5 members of the public come up and say, hey, don't worry about it. We got your back. And one guy even said, hey, I'll testify that he swung at you, if you needed your help. And there's no complaint, but just shows, during those calls, you get quite, amped up and, you just get frustrated that people, someone's passed away in the dignity and they're taking that away from them. Then in 2009, I remember being in my cabin, just started annual leave, I just put a steak on the barbecue, cracked a Corona, and my pager went off. And if you remember back in the day, the coolest people in the world were doctors and SWAT guys because we had pagers. So, my wife let me know, hey, your pager went off, and went in, and I said, well, I'm on annual leave. They won't need me in. And what happened is we had a prominent member of parliament that was within our city that wanted to commit suicide, and he had a handgun. So this information was going on. I called in saying I'm on holidays. They said we were short bodies. So went to the house right away. And through this all, our negotiators were emailing with this gentleman, and they could see that they'd send the emails and the emails would be read by him. So we tried everything to get into that house, to get communication. And we kept on, had information that he wanted to die from suicide by cops. So we ended up breaching the door, ended up getting in there. I remember when we first walked in, could smell gunpowder, but actually didn't really correlate that right off the bat. Took us quite a while, search the residence, and we found that the gentleman had taken his own life with a 44 Magnum handgun, which again wasn't really the best scene. The interesting part of this is, as we were going in, we had heard from the negotiators. He just answered another email, so we were pretty confident that he was going to be standing there with a handgun, and we were going to have to take his life. Little did we know later that the cell phone was lying to us. If you kind of remember back in the day, in 2009, Blackberries were pretty new, and he had his email hooked up to his Blackberry. So every time we sent an email, the email would go to his email and then go to his Blackberry, but it marked as read. So he had actually been passed away for a couple hours, but we were going in there thinking, one of the worst situations. We've all kind of been in those situations where you think, okay, here's a suicidal person that isn't willing to do it by themselves. It's going to be suicide by cop. So go back to the cabin that night. I remember my wife saying, we had young kids at the time, hey, can you pick up some milk and a couple things, because I was in town, come back out. Grabbed a Timmy's, got back about 3 or 4 in the morning, and went to sleep and woke up pretty tired. Now, also from those calls, I guarantee you there's people in this room that have had way worse calls, probably 5, 10 worse calls than that. I'm not saying that those, looking at those calls are the worst calls in the world. Everyone's been through some sort of trauma. Those are just some that, kind of affected me through my career. So the second night after coming back from that, I was asleep in the bed in my cabin, went to bed after a campfire. And I remember waking up about 2:00 in the morning, and the gentleman that had taken his life, his name was Dave. He's at the end of my bed. And I was going like, holy smokes, right? I'm having a nightmare. So anyways, I woke up and I was like, oh, thank God, right? I was just having a nightmare. And I look, and he was still there. So then I woke myself up again, and he is still there. So with this, so remember those dates from basically 2009 to 2021, every single dead body I went to would come back to me probably for about a week after in nightmares in my house. So people ask a lot of times, did your family know? Well, absolutely not. Like, do you want to tell your family, hey, everyone, I see ghosts, right? There's a ghost at the end of her bed. And every time I had these nightmares, so if I was in town and I'd gone to a dead body, and that night I was sleeping in my bed at home, I'd be in the exact same bed and the exact same sheets as being at home. Now, the one thing I say this, and I remember my psychologist laughed at me because I said, I was so thankful for this. And, the good news about this was, a lot of the people that we deal with when they're passed away aren't in a great state, whether it's by suicide. But every time they came back in my dreams, luckily they were they were beautiful. So like I had a young female that worked on CPR for quite a long time, young addict, malnourished, didn't really look good. But when she came back at the end of my bed, she was dressed beautifully, had beautiful skin. So everyone always came back in a nice, pure version of it. And I was always thankful for that. And I remember a psychologist saying like, well, I'm glad you're thankful for that. But there's times I wouldn't even tell my wife what was going on, but there's times where, I'd wake up with nightmares and I'd sweat so bad that I'd get up and have a quick shower. She'd change the sheets because I'd perspired through the sheets so bad. But again, she knew I was having nightmares. She never asked me what it was. And I never wanted to tell her because I was so scared of scaring her. But we had this kind of, little thing going on. I'd just get up, she'd change the sheets, I'd have a shower. So this went on for quite some time. And again, I didn't really want to tell people about this because I was worried, being a SWAT team leader, they kicked me off SWAT. They wouldn't have faith in me anymore. I was scared to tell anyone what was really happening behind closed doors. So 2016, so this is happening, going on, and I still remember my wife coming in one time, and I'd get home from work and I would just yell and scream at the kids because laundry wasn't folded or something was happening. And I remember my wife coming in saying, "Hey, the kids are just they're walking on eggshells around you. One day you're the happiest man ever and you're having fun, and other days you just come home and lose it." And it got also to the point where I was so tired because I wasn't sleeping good that, even my kids would be, "Hey, let's go play catch." And I'd go out there and I'd set a timer because I'd want to play for like 3 minutes before, being the good dad and playing catch, but I wasn't into it at all. My mind was always elsewhere. During that time, during 2016, I was working my regular job, patrol or CEU, as a SWAT team leader, as president of the SASFed, president of the RPA. And people are asked, why did you do all that? Well, I was trying to work like myself so hard that I would just pass out at night and be so exhausted. But there's actually time, though. You remember a couple of times when I was working day shift where I was driving home at 4 o'clock and I would actually pass out behind the wheel, totally sober, because I was so tired. And people would be honking, waking me up because I basically had passed out for being so tired. How did I deal with it? I wasn't sleeping good, so you take sleeping pills. Then you get tired, so you take wake up pills, energy drinks. A lot of people ask, what about alcohol? Yeah, there was a time where I'd keep a bottle of Jameson in the bottom freezer and drink before bed. But luckily at that point, though, as you remember, we were actually being utilized for SWAT quite a bit, and I never would show up to work intoxicated. And I was always worried about missing a call and something happening. So, I was happy that we were being busy with SWAT because I probably would have fallen into drinking a lot more and drinking myself out of that. But luckily with, having all those calls, I didn't get into alcohol. The other thing is back in 2016, I got part of CPSR, which is a national working group of first responders and public safety personnel. Was at a national forum where we realized our first responders were having issues with mental health. And during this time, CPSR came out with this great assessment tool, a screening tool. So I thought, hey, why don't I try this? So went to the tool, and as you can see with it, there's a lot of diagnostic tools. So anywhere from depression, PTSD, anxiety, panic disorder. So I thought, oh, let's see where I did this. So I went to the PTSD one, clicked on it, went through it, and you see it kind of goes from green to red. And I did this probably every 2 weeks for about a year. And every single time I was at like the end red. But I always went to myself, I'll get some help. I'm busy. I'll get some help later. I'm fine. So how did things finally change? Luckily through Vice, we had to do a safeguard, which is meeting with the psychologist every year. So I'd talk to psychologists because we helped develop this program through the service, and went in there and talked to her about CPSR and all the great things. And she went to walk out. She goes, "We have to fill out this questionnaire." So filled it out, and she looked at me and she's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, yeah, why not? She goes, "You're pretty messed up." And I looked, I'm like, "Yeah, I know, but I'll get help another time." And kind of realized at that time that I needed help. She worked out getting me help. And at that time, she thought it was going to be about 6 months to get help. And I remember she called me the next day being like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm okay. Should I not be okay?" And, just from what they saw, they were pretty worried about, getting me that help. And luckily they were able to get me in within a month to a great psychologist. So I still see to this day. So, but I treated this like a sprained ankle. So a few things I said is I would not take any time off and I'd never take medication. and I went through exposure therapy. And I'm not going to lie, exposure therapy is not fun at all. It does help. It is amazing. But when I first started going through therapy, I'd go later in the afternoon. And the first time I went, it was about 3 o'clock. I went to it and I walked out afterwards and I puked my guts out. So I used to not eat before I went because I didn't want to be sick. So after about 3 months, the psychologist said, like, you don't look good. I said, well, I'm always sick after. So, I never eat. She goes, why don't we switch your meeting until 9:30 and then you could have breakfast after. So I would go to exposure therapy and then I'd go to work afterwards. And I was just exhausted. And although it was working, it wasn't working. She said it's like a sprained ankle. I kept on trying to play on it. It'd get a little bit better, but wasn't getting that better. So I ended up taking some time off. So one of the things that happened, as you see, is I kind of went into hiding. At this time, I started gaining a lot of weight. I knew I was in trouble, grew a big beard because I wanted to hide behind what was happening. So I was off for about 3 months, October 27th to January 10th. Being off was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. Just all of a sudden being home with your thoughts, no one around. Luckily, I had 2 great dogs that I walked and got back into exercise and did extensive therapy, but I needed to take that time off to get better. So how did I know I was getting better? My family could see it. They could say, you're dad again, right? You're happy again. You're not losing on us because we haven't folded the laundry. Although I know my family's on here. Please, if the laundry's in the basket, fold it. I'd appreciate it. I'll be honest, I still have nightmares. Luckily, it's probably one every month. Actually went about 3 months without having one. I know that I probably will always have nightmares, but they've gone a lot better. During this time, I actually even signed up for PSPNET, which we'll talk about, which is Internet Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and learned how to deal with stress and how to get better. So some of the indicators that I think all of us can understand is I was tired. I'd lie in bed, not answer the phone. I'd see someone phoning me. I'd just ignore it. Spend 2 hours scrolling on my phone without knowing really what I was doing. Not hanging out with people that I used to always hang out with, not answering phone calls, not going out with people, losing it, short fuse. And you know what? I got fat. I'll be the first to admit it. I gained about 30 pounds. And that's one of the reasons I grew the beard, because I wanted people to see this big shaggy beard and not see how miserable I was behind it, how sad I was, and how much weight that I'd gained. So one thing that I find that is super important that I think we really got to do is mental and physical health do go together. We need to prioritize exercise. Sometimes you need to get your ass out of bed, even when you're down, and have a good workout. The best stress relief out there isn't a bottle, isn't watching TV. It's getting out there and having, a long walk with your spouse or your family, your dog, a good workout. The other thing that I found is when I got fat, it really affected my mind. I was in SWAT, I was in pretty decent shape, and now my clothes didn't fit. And, I was out of breath walking upstairs and just miserable, and how that even affected my mental health. So, we really need to know that when we talk about health, it's mental and physical health. We need to do those things to continue to get better. But what I wanted to share this is when I was going through this journey, when I was off, I had one of my buddies that didn't see me around work, and he goes, Case, you want to go for a coffee? He's like, man, what? You haven't been at work. What's going on? And, someone I respected quite a bit. And I told him why I was off. And I told him about the nightmares, the first person I ever told to. And he looked at me across the table. He goes, you too? And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, you have nightmares too? I do too. And although I haven't shared my story a lot of the people I have shared it with along the way, I found were in the same boat with me and didn't want to speak up. So, I want to share this story with people to know that you're not alone. We are all going through these things. We're all together. And the good thing is if you get help and you do these things, it does really help. And you can get back to being that good, mother, father, spouse, husband, wife, whatever it is. And just, you do get support. The stigma is being reduced. Through my whole time, when people found out, not one person ever came up to me and, said anything negative, and maybe they wouldn't, but, there's so much support that I had going through this journey. So that's why I call it my story, our story, because I know that, on this call, there's probably a ton of people also going through this, and we're all together. Now, what I'm really happy about is there's some great tools that Heather and Nathalie are going to talk about that I wish I had before, that I could have done throughout my career, that hopefully I wouldn't have been at the end to have to take that time off, that I could have built some of that resiliency and done some of that treatment before. So again, with the questions, that kind of wraps up my presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Heather, but please start asking questions if you have any, and then we'll answer them at the end. But just thanks for giving me a few minutes of your time.